Snowed Up by Edwin Waugh, narrated by Malc Cowle, Chapter 4. The night drave on with songs and clatter, and the ale was growing better. The Souter told his queerest stories, the landlord's laugh was ready chorus. The storm without might rare and rustle, Tam didna mind the storm a wustle. Burns. In the pause which followed the quarryman's story, Giles had come in from the stables, bringing the news that the storm was as wild and the snow falling as thickly as ever. The two Yorkshire travellers, also hearing the laughter, had left the parlour, and were now quietly seated in the kitchen with the rest, waiting for the sexton's story. The girl was replenishing the glasses, and whilst the sexton sat looking thoughtfully into the fire, the rest of the company were engaged in a little discursive chat about the weather. The sexton was a man of more education than was common among people of his class. In fact, he was a naturally studious and bookish man, well read in such books as chance had thrown in his way, and he had a quaint liking for all kinds of antiquarian lore. Of such matters he had stored up a curious and considerable collection in the course of his life, and he had often walked 11 miles from Rochdale town to consult volumes in the old Chetham Library at Manchester on points relative to local history. On such subjects he was looked up to by his neighbours as a great authority. He had no pretence to scholarly or symmetrical culture. The sphere of life in which he was brought up had denied him that rare advantage, but he was gifted with an observant and susceptible spirit, and an exceedingly retentive memory, which has stored his mind with a great amount of quaint, though ill-assorted matter. These qualities and acquirements, together with a rich flavour of humour, which was one of the most distinguished features of his character, made him much sought after by people of his own neighbourhood and standing, and, not unfrequently, a welcome guest amongst those of higher pretences. And he was not the less welcome to a certain class of local magnates, in those days of tethered thought and cherished ignorance, that he was a man of strong prejudices and narrow political vision, like themselves. On political and religious questions, he neither dared nor cared to speculate. In these respects, he'd been born in a hereditary rut, from which the circumstances of his life and time seemed to deny him the chance of ever coming out. Apart from such questions, however, he was at all times an ingenious, good-natured, and amusing companion. The sexton was a great snuff-taker, and before he began he took a huge pinch with evident satisfaction, and then laid the box down upon the table before him, as if it was a thing he was likely to want oftener than usual during the next half hour, and when he'd brushed the brown dust off his clothes with a large silk handkerchief of antique pattern, he began a kind of historic and topographical preamble. He prefaced his story with a description of the town and neighbourhood in which the scene was laid. He did it, too, in good set terms, although no doubt some of the listeners might think it a little tedious, and feel impatient to get at the pith of the story long before he reached it himself. But it was especially addressed to the two strangers, who knew little of the neighbourhood. He took another pinch, and laying his box down upon the table again, he commenced as follows, though not exactly in the following words. The first scene of the story is the interior of an old-fashioned inn, opposite to the south side of the ancient parish church of Rochdale. It stands immediately in front of the gates, which lead into the churchyard, from which it is divided by a narrow street, which was the principal, if not the only, thoroughfare of Rochdale town in Saxon times, when it must have been only a rude village, ruled by the Saxon thanes of the castle, which stood in those days upon the summit of a steep eminence, about a quarter of a mile west of the church, overlooking a green holm by the side of the slow-winding Roach. The old inn, called the Oak, is a quaint building, and it is the house at which people used to put up who attended funerals from long distances in the country. The parish of Rochdale is of great extent, and not infrequently the dead are brought 10 or 12 miles distance to be laid down in the old churchyard, which was the favourite burial ground at the time of our story, when there were fewer chapels of ease and other places of worship scattered over the parish than there are now. Sometimes several of these country funerals met at Rochdale Church on the same day, and then the inn, opposite the church gates, would be crowded with different parties of moorland farmers and their families who had come from the surrounding hills to bury their dead. A wide flagged footpath between the gravestones in the churchyard led from the great gate up to the porch of the church, and it was on this pathway that the several bodies were laid at such times upon biers, covered with palls, awaiting the commencement of the funeral ceremonies. The front windows of the inn commanded a full view of this path of the dead, and during the interval between the arrival of the bodies and the time of interment, the different companies of mourners who had followed the remains, which stood here and there upon the churchyard path to their last home, would sit at these windows, giving a sad eye now and then to the poor relic which was their especial care, with a jealous twinge of pain every time it was touched by cold official hands. One wintry day, when some half-dozen of these country funerals had met at the churchyard, and the several coffins stood upon their biers in this pathway, waiting the appearance of the surpliced vicar at the little door which led from the vicarage into the churchyard, the sexton and his assistants were just beginning to arrange the different bodies in the order of their procession, when a stalwart young farmer from the hills rushed out of the inn, and dashing the sexton and his men away from the coffin in which his mother lay, he cried out, "Hands off that coffin, that's our burying." "But," continued the sexton, addressing himself specially to the 2 Yorkshire strangers, "I only say this that you may have some idea of the place and the neighbourhood, for though the tale which I am going to tell may be called a grave story, you will find that it has no particular connection with the melancholy of a funeral." Then, pausing and taking another pinch of snuff, he went on again in a dreamy tone, as if his thoughts were wandering back into what he loved to call the good old times, according to his wont. "Rochdale was a quaint old town 50 years ago," said he with a sigh. "It was not a fourth of the size it is now, and it was full of picturesque old buildings and curious nooks and corners. But they are fast disappearing," continued he, giving another long-drawn sigh, and taking another pinch of snuff. "They are fast disappearing, like the good old customs of our ancestors. I remember, when I was a lad, the picturesque appearance of the buildings around the old market-place, where the ancient cross stood in Catholic times. The old-fashioned inn, called the Horse Mill, was standing then, with its antique gateway, and the old centre of the town had a picturesque aspect. But it's changing fast. They men corners left, and clock face, and twitch. This was a narrow passage, through which nobody but a thin person could pass. And Theagle Yard and Bullbrook are left," continued he, "and th' Manor House at Byron's." There was a touch of increased importance in his tone when he uttered this, after which his voice sank down again, and he went on, "And the bowling green's left," said he, "and th' old corn mill, and the grammar school built in Queen Elizabeth's time, but th' old features are rapidly passing away. Town centres creeping up towards Yorkshire, and I shouldn't wonder but somebody'll live to see the day when th' old shooting butts will be built on, and a garden swept away from waterside." And thus he wandered on among the visions of the past, blending with fears of the future in a dreamy reverie, till, suddenly recollecting himself and seeing that some of his listeners were beginning to yawn, he said, as he took another pinch of snuff, "Well, well, let it go. We're all going the same way. And now for this story," said he. It had been market day in the town of Rochdale, and the streets about the old market-place had been thronged with manufacturers and merchants, for it was Big Monday, as the chief fortnightly market for woollens is still called in that town. Many of these manufacturers were little makers, that is, farmers from the neighbouring hills, who in addition to their agricultural labour made flannels on their own account, and sometimes bore them miles away from their own homes down to the Rochdale market upon their backs, slung by a broad strap around the forehead. The inns near the narrow streets, called Blackwater Street and Toll Lane, in which the flannel market was chiefly held, had been filled all day with buyers and sellers. The Roebuck, the Angel, the Saddle, the Coach and Horses, the Bishop Blaine, the Amen Corner, the Bluebell, and the ancient inn called the Clock Face, which was a dwelling-house of the famous Chetham family in the reign of Charles I. These had all been swarming from morn to night with country manufacturers from the hills and cloughs in the neighbourhood of the town, and with buyers from all parts of the kingdom, and it had snowed of meat and drink, as old Chaucer says, in these quaint hostelries throughout the whole of the day, till the very air of that part of the town was redolent to bountiful cougaree. Up in thy part of the town, near the parish church, the busy life of that day had presented somewhat different features to those which had stirred the neighbourhood of the market-place, for in the ancient street on the south side of the church, the great cow fair had been held, and the quaint inn, fronting the entrance to the churchyard, had swarmed with moorland farmers and cattle dealers from early morning. As night drew near, most of these had trickled away from the scene towards their distant homes, and the sounds of revelry grew fainter and fainter as darkness began to fall, and the last lingerers wandered away to the more central part of the town down by the riverside. By the time the clock of St. Chad's had tolled the hour of 11, the street in which the cow fair had been held, which was all strewn with relics of the bovine throng, had become still, and very little was to be heard except the dying buzz of midnight life in the town, at the foot of the church steps, or the maundering ditty of some late wassailor reeling homeward along the slippery street, and the wind wailing and moaning in the trees of the vicarage. 12:15. The chimes of the old church struck up o'er the hills and far away, and in many an old inn down in the town, the landlord had already warned his customers that it was time to shut up for the night. "Now, lads, it's close upon 12. Come, sup up and be going." 12. The old church clock struck the hour in slow and solemn tones, which floated over the town at the foot of the hill and along the stilling valley, and up the steep which slopes northwards from the riverside. Before the last stroke had died away upon the midnight air, the times changed and struck up "Life Let Us Cherish," the melody for the new day, and the chirrupy notes were taken up by many a late wanderer as he reeled homeward in the dark.